SpaceX did not just fly another test rocket. Flight 13 may be the first Starship test that directly changes the investor story. The reason is simple. For the first time, Starship carried real Starlink V3 satellites, deployed them, talked to them, completed an in-space Raptor relight, and brought the ship back intact enough to study the heat shield. That does not mean the whole bull case is proven. It does mean the question has changed. Before Flight 13, the question was mostly, can Starship work at all? After Flight 13, the better question is, can Starship become the deployment machine for the next Starlink network? That is a very different investor question. This is not a normal stock chart video. SpaceX is still a private company. There is no clean public ticker where we can pull up a normal candlestick chart and call it technical analysis. Forge Global private market data also did not provide a current evaluated per-share SpaceX price for this update. So the honest way to analyze SpaceX is not to pretend there is a perfect live quote. The honest way is to map technical milestones to private market valuation credibility. And on that map, Flight 13 was a serious milestone. Here is the investor thesis in one sentence. If Starship becomes a repeatable Starlink V3 deployment system, SpaceX starts looking less like a launch company and more like a vertically integrated space infrastructure network. That is why Flight 13 matters. Not because it was perfect, it was not perfect, but because it connected Starship directly to Starlink V3 in a way previous flights did not. Let us start with what actually happened. SpaceX says Starship deployed all 20 Starlink V3 satellites. SpaceX also says its teams communicated with every satellite over radio frequency links and laser links. That is important because these were not just mass simulators. They were test satellites for the next version of Starlink. And Starlink V3 is the bridge between the rocket story and the business story. The market loves dramatic rocket footage, but the business case is capacity, cost, and cadence. Can SpaceX put more satellite capacity into orbit? Can it do that more often? Can it lower the cost per unit of network capacity? And can that network create enough cash flow to justify the huge capital intensity of Starship? That is the real debate. So when Starship deploys Starlink V3 satellites successfully, the event is bigger than a test flight. It is the first look at the flywheel. Starship carries bigger satellites. Bigger satellites improve Starlink capacity. Higher capacity improves the network economics. Better network economics can support more launches, more manufacturing, more infrastructure, and potentially a higher private market valuation. That is the loop investors are watching. The second milestone is the in-space Raptor relight. After deployment, Starship completed a single-engine relight in space. SpaceX described this as a core capability for future orbital missions. That phrase matters. Future orbital missions need controlled engine starts in space. They need orbital insertion profiles. They need controlled deorbit. They need the vehicle to behave like a transportation infrastructure, not just like an experimental booster stack. So the relight is not a random technical detail. It is one of the checkboxes between spectacular test article and operational system. And that is exactly where the valuation debate lives. Private markets do not only reward the dream, they reward the dream becoming de-risked one milestone at a time. Flight 13 did that. Now let us talk about the hidden story, the heat shield. Starship returned intact in the Indian Ocean. That may sound less exciting than a launch or a catch, but it may be one of the most important parts of the flight. If the heat shield is the bottleneck for reuse, then an intact ship is a data goldmine. SpaceX can inspect what survived. It can inspect what failed. It can compare the real re-entry environment to the models. It can decide which tiles need redesign, which attachment points need work, and which parts of the vehicle are closer to reuse than expected. An explosion gives data too, but an intact vehicle gives a different kind of data. That is why I would not treat the splashdown as a minor detail. For an investor, the splashdown is a question about the path to reuse, and the path to reuse is the path to cost reduction. But now we have to be honest about the bear case. Flight 13 was not a clean win across the entire stack. The booster still ended with a hard splashdown. Space News reported that not all engines needed for the landing burn started, and the booster hit the water faster than planned. That matters. The full Starship economics depend on both parts of the system becoming reliable. If the ship improves, but the booster remains difficult to recover, the economics are not fully unlocked. If engine relight reliability remains uneven, the schedule can slip. If the heat shield needs more redesign, reuse can remain farther away than bulls want. And if cadence stays low, Starship cannot yet become the Starlink V3 machine investors are imagining. So the fair read is this: bulls got real evidence. Bears still have real risks. That is why this week's video is not SpaceX is guaranteed to the moon. The better title is Flight 13 changed the valuation story, but it did not finish it. Now let us connect this to the valuation ladder. According to Forge Global Private Market data accessed through Perplexity Finance, SpaceX remains privately held. The same data did not give a current evaluated per-share private market price in this update, but it did show major valuation markers: a late 2024 tender offer valuation of $350 billion, a late 2025 tender offer valuation of $800 billion, and a February 2026 corporate round valuation of $1.25 trillion. Those numbers are huge. They also raise the bar. At that scale, the market is not just paying for rockets. It is paying for a future system. It is paying for Starlink scale. It is paying for lower launch cost. It is paying for reuse. It is paying for the possibility that SpaceX controls a critical layer of space infrastructure. That is why Flight 13 matters so much. It gives the valuation story a more concrete operating milestone. It says Starship is not just being developed beside Starlink. It says Starship may become the vehicle that unlocks the next Starlink architecture. That is the difference between hype and infrastructure. For this week, I would divide the SpaceX investor setup into 3 zones. Zone 1 is the proof zone. This is where Flight 13 sits. SpaceX proved that Starship can deploy Starlink V3 test satellites, complete an in-space relight, and return the ship intact. Zone 2 is the repeatability zone. This is where the market needs more evidence. One successful test is not a business model.
Investors need cadence, multiple deployments, better booster outcomes, improved heat shield data, and a path toward operational reuse. Zone 3 is the infrastructure zone. This is the big bull case. If Starship can repeatedly deploy Starlink V3, and if Starlink V3 materially improves network capacity and unit economics, then SpaceX is not just selling launch, it is building and operating a space-based broadband infrastructure layer. That is the zone where the huge valuation argument becomes more credible. The next catalyst is Flight 14. Ars Technica reported that SpaceX is eyeing a tower catch for the next Starship after the strong ending to Flight 13. If SpaceX moves toward a ship catch or a more aggressive return profile, that becomes the next big investor milestone. But I would watch the details. Does the booster relight sequence improve? Does the ship heat shield look better after inspection? Does SpaceX increase cadence? Does Starlink V3 move from test deployment to repeatable deployment? Those are the questions that matter more than one viral clip. My bottom line is this: Flight 13 did not prove that SpaceX deserves any specific valuation. It did not give us a public share price. It did not erase booster risk, and it did not make Starship fully operational. But it did connect the rocket story to the Starlink V3 business story. That is why I think Flight 13 may be one of the most important investor events in the Starship program so far. The